My Gavanen Melunin, and well met indeed. I am Arachir Galajerthan, and welcome to another lore cast in Middle-earth, and this time dealing with Minas Tirith, the great city of Gondor. I wanted to keep with the theme of Gondor, and just to give you all some warning going forward, I don't want to cover topics I have covered before, so I've thrown out my previous roadmap, which I appreciate I had not explained to any of you, but I've gotten rid of it, and we shall now be discussing topics that I have not discussed in lore videos before. And we will start, as I say, with Minas Tirith. There are no special thanks or extra thanks at the start of this episode, but a thanks in general to you all for the continued support of the channel, continued following of Divide and Conquer, and of course those who support me on Patreon. So Minas Tirith, the great capital city of Gondor in the Third Age, but of course not always known as such. And the names that we most commonly use for the city are Minas Tirith, of course, the Tower of Guard, or the Guarded City, is what the name means. Minas means tower, or city with encircling wall, or words to those effect, and Tirith literally means guard. So Minas Tirith is Tower of Guard quite literally, but is often called the Guarded City. Before it was known as Minas Tirith, it was of course called Minas Anor, which means Tower of the Sun, or Sun Tower, or indeed Sun City, and Anor means sun, the same root found in Anarion, the son of Elendil. It's also known as the Mundberg, chiefly by the Eored First, or the Eotheod. I've never been sure on the pronunciation of Eotheod, but Eorl calls it the Mundberg in his speeches before he rides to assist and is obviously gifted Calanathan, and Rohan thereafter calls it Mundberg, or the Mundberg. And this just means guardian fortress in their own language, which I believe is heavily based on Anglo-Saxon. And lastly, its moniker is the City of Kings. And this is an interesting one, because for much of Minas Tirith's history, it was nothing but a fortress. It wasn't the capital city, and it wasn't the seat of the kings. But most of the kings of Gondor are buried there, so I'm wondering if whether or not it's called the City of Kings for one of three reasons. Chiefly because kings did live there by the time of the War of the Ring, or because the kings of Gondor are buried there, or because it is simply worthy of the kings of Gondor. Each of those, I believe, is arguably a reason for the name City of Kings, but it's most likely that in the Third Age, when we primarily deal with Minas Tirith, it is of course the seat of the kings of Gondor. And the Gondorian kings are the only kings outside of the, obviously, King Theoden, and arguably the dwarves also, of course, have kings. But whilst Thranduil is known as a king, Celeborn and Galadriel, are they ever referred to as king and queen? More lord and lady, isn't it? Anyway, that's tangential, we're talking about kings. So let's deal with Minas Tirith, and starting with a brief history of the city. So it was founded and completed by the coming Númenóreans, the Exiles, in the year 3320 of the Second Age. This is about 120 odd years before the final end of the Second Age. So it has... But what we are not certain of is if it was completed within a year, which would be absolutely remarkable. If it took 10 years, 20 years, 7 years, there's just no guidance. We just know that it was completed with the founding of the realms in exile at the end of the Second Age. And originally, Minas Tirith's purpose was simply a fortress. It was built to guard the capital city of Osgiliath, which of course sits between it and its sister city, Minas Ithil. Minas Ithil meaning Moon Tower, and again, same root word found in Ecthelion, which is lands of the moon, and Isildur to some extent. But at that time, it wasn't really a city, it was a fortress, it was a guardian. It guarded the western side of Osgiliath, which stretched across the Anduin, of course. At its original founding, it was the seat of power for Anarion, the son of Elendil, until, of course, his death in the Last Alliance, when Gondor then only had a single king. So Gondor only had two kings for the life of Anarion and Isildur, and upon their deaths, Gondor obviously only had a single king who sat in Osgiliath. But both Anarion and Isildur did sit in Osgiliath. Their thrones were side by side in the Great Hall in Osgiliath, but they each independently then... Minas Anor was kind of Anarion's actual home, and Isildur likewise for Minas Ithil. Minas Tirith was known as Minas Anor for 2,000 years, until the final fall of Minas Ithil with the return of the Witch King after his defeat against the Northern Realms, or rather Gondor in the north, in the year 2002 of the Second Age, or Third Age, sorry. So Minas Anor for about 2,100-ish years it's known, and then it's known as Minas Tirith for about 1,000 years. So it's known as Minas Anor for more time than Tirith. But at that time it's changed to the guarded city because of course Minas Ithil falls, and then Minas Tirith becomes the bastion against the might of Mordor. At the time that it changed to Minas Tirith, it had already become Gondor's chief city. Osgiliath had been dealt a crippling blow in the Kinstrife, with much of the city being ruined in the civil war that struck Gondor. And the kings of Gondor had already lived in Minas Tirith for about 400 years by the time that it actually became Minas Tirith. So the kings lived there an awful lot longer. Osgiliath was abandoned as a kingly residence quite some time before Minas Tirith became known as such. We are not sure if all of the 7 levels of the city were completed at the same time, because we know that various aspects of the city were built at later points, and we just don't have enough information. So it could well have been that when the city was actually founded, it was maybe only a couple of levels, and then over time, through necessity, they expanded up and up and up and up, or they maybe built all 7 at once. But what we do know is that the White Tower, the great tower of Minas Tirith, where the Palantir is housed, was not constructed until the year 1900 of the Third Age, about 100 years before the fall of Minas Ithil. And that was built to house the Palantir, and it was built by King Kalimetar, one of the 4 ship kings of Gondor, the sort of height of, or just shy of the height of their power, or just after rather, sorry. Furthermore, despite having plenty of abandoned and disused houses at the time of the War of the Ring, Minas Tirith and the Pellinore Fields are actually said to house the majority of Gondor's population by that time. So when we had described Minas Tirith in the first chapter of The Return of the King, Pippin notes how many houses don't have people in them and are totally abandoned. Now, whether or not that is because the people have already fled, or whether that is because people simply no longer live there as much, maybe they've died through wars, or maybe indeed they've fled, as I already say. Or is it just that the city is simply underused? People just have not filled the gaps. But it is said that Minas Tirith and the Pellinore Fields before it house the majority of Gondor's population. So that's very interesting to note, because Gondor is vast, as I'm sure you are aware on any map of Middle-earth. Gondor is enormous. But despite its size, most of its people still live in one isolated city right on the eastern edge. Now, I know that's not uncommon in the real world, for example. Mongolia is absolutely gigantic, but most of its people live in its capital city, Ulaanbaatar. New Zealand is very similar, of course. Most of your people in New Zealand live in Auckland. So it's not uncommon, but it's just Gondor is bloody massive. But most people live in Minas Tirith. So on to then the geography of the city itself. Minas Tirith is built on a hill which sits at the base of Mount Mindalluin. Mindalluin translates generally as towering blue head, so it's sort of like tall blue mountain, is a good approximation. And the city is built around what is known as a great knee of the mountain, and this is the large rocky sort of sail. It looks like a sail or the prow of a ship that rises from ground level all the way up to the top where the height of Minas Tirith can be found. This I want to say precipice, but that's totally the wrong word. This knee, this great rock sail, is 700 foot from feet to base. From feet to base, that doesn't make sense. 700 foot from base to top. And Minas Tirith is built around it, but it is built on a hill. So Minas Tirith isn't underneath the streets and the cities and the houses of Minas Tirith. The cities underneath the houses and the streets, there isn't just rock that the Gondorians have built. There is a hill. There is actual earth, but the hill only rises to, I believe, the 5th level. As we will get to that in a moment, anyway. So the hill doesn't go all the way to the top. So the top 2 levels are built on. Are constructed by the Gondorians on their own foundations. The land beyond the city, so the Pellinore Fields, as of course they're known, we'll talk more about them in a moment, but that land is incredibly fertile and is a gentle slope down to the banks of the Anduin. So whilst Minas Tirith is on a stark hill and then of course this large prow-like rock structure, the lands in front of Minas Tirith are actually very fertile, very gentle, and a good place for farming and living. To the east and southeast of Minas Tirith, of course, lies the great river Anduin. To the north is the land known as Anorion, or Lands of the Sun, they're equal to Ecthelion. The Stonewain Valley is also off to the northwest, which of course cuts through the Druadan Forest and is the chief location, I believe, of much of the stone that was hewn for the construction of Minas Tirith, and that was how the Stonewain Valley came into being. It was the quarry for the construction of Minas Tirith. To the south, between the spurs of the White Mountains and the Great Anduin River, is a narrow passage of land that leads down to the, of course, the Vale of Lasarnak, the Valley of Tumladen, and on to the fiefs of Gondor. Finally, just up behind the city, there is a long, steep path that leads from the highest level of Minas Tirith up into the sides of Mount Mindalluin itself, and that was a path that was only used ever by the kings of Gondor, and it most famously is known for the location where Gandalf leads Aragorn to after his coronation, and they find a sapling of Nimloth, the white tree, and that is where it then becomes replanted. So unlike in the film, the tree doesn't suddenly reflower. The dead tree is removed, and a sapling of the white tree is found in the mountain behind Minas Tirith and brought down to the courtyard. So moving on, we come to the outer city before we arrive at the city proper. And if you were to ride to Minas Tirith before you do get to the Great Wall, or the City Wall as it's called, you must first pass through one of the gates of the Ramas Ekor. Now this is called the Encircling Wall, or Great Outer Wall is what Ramas Ekor translates to. But it isn't actually that old. It was constructed by Ecthelion II, who was the father of the Denethor we all know in the Third Age. So Boromir and Faramir's grandfather. It is not an old feature. It's very new in the lifetime of Minas Tirith, and it was built at the time that Ecthelion was fully lost to Mordor. So by the time of the Third Age, of course, we meet Faramir in Ecthelion, and he and a small group of rangers live in Henneth Anun. But no one else lives in Ecthelion. It is entirely Mordor's land, and Uruks and Orcs patrol the eastern banks of the Anduin River. And so when they actually lost Ecthelion in about, years don't really help, but equating it to the actual, about 60 years before the time of the War of the Ring is when the Ramas Ekor was actually built. So not very old at all. The wall itself is almost 10 leagues long if you were to walk from the start to the finish. And a league, which I'm sure you're all wondering, is the equivalent to 3 of our miles. So that is 30 miles in length. That's insane. To the east of Minas Tirith is where it reaches its furthest point away from the city, where it's said to be 4 leagues away from Minas Tirith, so 12 miles. And that's the gate to Osgiliath. To the south is where it is only 1 league from the city, the closest point, and this is where the Harlond is situated. Of course, not to be confused with the Harlond of Lindon. The Harlond literally just means Southern Haven or South Haven or South Port, for example. And that is the chief port for Minas Tirith after the fall of Osgiliath some years prior. So if you look at a map of Minas Tirith, you'll see there's a bend in the River Anduin immediately after Osgiliath, and just at the apex of that bend, if you're not familiar with that term, is where the Harlond is situated, or just slightly north of it. And the Ramas Ekor goes up to the Harlond, and that's where it bounds. So it goes from the mountains to the river. The gate, or the wall, has possibly 7 specific gates, and each had a different password. But this could actually refer to the gates of the city itself and not possibly the Ramas Ekor. And the reason I say that is because when Gandalf and Pippin arrive at the northern gate, coming of course from Rohan, they meet a gentleman called Ingold who says that even though Gandalf knows the passwords to the 7 gates, but he's not specific in saying that they're the gates of Minas Tirith. So it could well be that the Ramas Ekor has 7 gates, or he could just be referring to the 7 passworded gates of the city itself. But anyway, we know that the Ramas Ekor has 3 chief gates. The northern one, of course, which goes to Rohan, which is virtually unused at the time of the War of the Ring. Because little traffic passes between Gondor and Rohan, and only really outriders and messengers use this path. The eastern gate, of course, which is the gate out to Osgiliath, which is the most defended gate, of course, because it comes from Mordor. And here, the gate and the towers and the defences are collectively known as the Causeway Forts, and it's here, of course, that Faramir flees from when Mordor eventually claim the crossings of Osgiliath. And then finally the southern gate, of course, which leads down, as I say, to the Vale of Osgiliath, of Lossarnach, and then onto the Valley of Tumladen. Not, again, to be confused with the valley of the same name that housed the city of Gondolin in the First Age. Tolkien just likes to reuse the words, but then why wouldn't he? They mean the same things. So the southern gate, the eastern gate, and the northern gate are the chief gates, but there may well be other gates in the walls. The wall, by the time of the War of the Ring, had actually fallen into quite bad disrepair, and Denethor had ordered that it be repaired and rebuilt. And that is when Ingold and Gandalf have their discussion. Gandalf mentions the famous line that courage is the best defense that they have now, but Ingold then says, we've finished all of the repairs, this gate is the last one, and we left it to last because of course we're not expecting enemies to come from Rohan. So the wall is being repaired in the time of the War of the Ring, but had fallen into disuse. The land between the Ramosecor and Minas Tirith, as I've already mentioned, is called, of course, the Pellinore Fields, and Pellinore means fenced land. These lands are very, very fertile, and they house many little hamlets and villages and farmers, specifically. They're also colloquially or collectively known as the townlands of Minas Tirith. So the Pellinore Fields, or the townlands, which I think is quite an interesting little name, because, as I say, lots of hamlets and villages do mark the terrain there. It's quite a large expanse. As I say, the wall is 12 miles from the Osgiliath Gate to Minas Tirith, and that is no small space. You can farm an awful lot in that. So, and they do. It is, of course, the sort of breadbasket, if you will, for Minas Tirith. I've already mentioned that 3 great roads snake through these townlands. Obviously, the North Road, the East Road, and the South Road. And they can be seen from the city itself, like rivers almost through the fertile land. So then we've ridden through the Pellinore Fields, we've passed the farmlands, we've gone through the Causeway Forts, and now you've arrived at the city proper. The great city of Minas Tirith is of course built over 7 levels, with the Citadel and the White Tower on the highest, the 7th level. Each level is encircled with its own wall, and the gates of each level are positioned as far away from the one above and below as possible. So so they are laid out thus. The Great Gate, the first level, the one you enter to get into the city, faces to the east. Then the next gate faces to the southeast. Then the next one to the northeast, and then the next to the southeast, etc., etc. So that as invaders climb through the levels of Minas Tirith, they zigzag back and forth on themselves, constantly under fire from the walls above. It is an absolute nightmare to capture Minas Tirith, and it would have just been a real task for Mordor to have done it. The city is so well laid out for defenders. The outer wall of the city is known as the City Wall, and it is built using the same stone, but more importantly the same skills and techniques as were used by the Númenóreans to build Orthanc. And this level is nigh impenetrable. Only a great earth-shattering earthquake would be able to break the lower wall. And indeed, when Sauron actually attacks the city at the end of the War of the Ring, in the Siege of Gondor and the Battle of the Pellinore Fields, the orcs don't even bother trying to break down the wall because they know they can't, and instead they focus on the gate. That is the weak point. That is the Achilles heel of this great city war. But chiefly, and most importantly and interestingly, and one of those facts where you get to impress your friends when they incorrectly mention it, is that the lowest level wall of Minas Tirith is said to be black. It is not white. The city, of course, is white. Every level, every building, the entire city is a great glistening beacon. And when the sun captures it, it must be dazzling. But the lowest level is said to be of dark stone. So it may not be jet black, but it's dark. It is not white. That's very specifically not white. But in a lot of representations of Minas Tirith, of course, they use the film's adaptation. So it is usually a sort of dull grey, or indeed just actually white. But it should be very dark. We don't actually have the names of very many streets in the city, but we do have a few. And again, most of them come from the first chapter of The Return of the King, fortunately. It's where most of the description of Minas Tirith comes from. There are other mentions in a few other places. But from that, we get the Rath Caledine, which is the Lamprights Street. And it's here Pippin meets Beregond's son. And that is down on the lowest level. We also, of course, very famously know the Rath Dinan, which is the Silent Street and leads down to the tombs, or the Hallows of Minas Tirith as it's called, where the tombs of the kings can be found. So the Rath Dinan is on the 6th level, but it leads down to about the equivalent of the 5th level. This is, as I say, where the hill that Minas Tirith is built upon rises to, the height of the 5th level. Great ramparts are then built atop it, so that the hill is absolutely unassailable. No one would be able to circumvent the lower walls of Minas Tirith. And it's here in the top of the hill that, as I say, the domed mausoleums of the tombs of the kings can be found. The Rathdinan is accessed by a gate known as Fen Hollen. This means shut door, and it's called that because it is only really ever opened for funeral processions, which are very rare, and of course they need to be royal or kingly processions. They're not just for any old dead person. And necessary works to the Rathdinan or to the tombs. So it's closed most of the time. The stables of the city are located on the 6th level, and this is because Gondor is quite famously not a horse-based nation. And you see this as well, actually, when the kings and the lords and the princes of the fiefs come to aid Gondor. Very few of them actually ride horses, and indeed, the only ones we really know of to actually ride a horse are, of course, Imrahil and the Swan Knights of Dol Amroth, and Forlong the Fat from Lasarnak, he comes on a horse, and I believe also the riders, or not riders, I'm not sure it doesn't use the word rider, but I believe those from Pinnith Gelin may come on horses, but most of them come on foot, and Gondor is not a horse-based nation at all, so the horses are chiefly used for messengers and outriders, not for war. And so, as the messengers are always invariably sending messages from either the steward or the king or someone in the court of the city, those messages are coming from the 7th level. So the stables need to be as near to the 7th as possible, because then the horse can cover the city quicker and then you're out and you're gone. Whereas if the stables were on the lowest level, you'd have to do 5 or 6 levels on foot before you even got to your horse. It's just slower. So the stables are right up on the 6th level. It also, of course, from a war and practical point of view, you don't really want your horses getting massacred. If the enemy only takes the bottom 2 levels, but then you beat them, you don't want to have lost all of your horses in that fray. And also, you wouldn't want horses running about when you're trying to defend the city. You don't want to get knocked over by your own horse. So it serves a good purpose to have the horses as high up and as far away from the battle and fighting as possible. Famously as well, the Houses of Healing are located on the 6th level, and this is of course where Aragorn visits to save Éowyn after she and Merry come to face with the Witch King of Angmar and indeed end him. And Aragorn sneaks into the city and heals Éowyn here in the Houses of Healing. And they are built right up near the Citadel Gate, so they're about as close to the 7th level gate as they can be. Because, of course, you also want your kings and people like that to be able to be healed quickly, so it makes sense to have the hospital nearest the palace. If I was building a city and I was going to live in it, I'd want the hospital to be near to my house as well. The Citadel itself was built for war and not for comfort, and it's little changed from its original founding way back in the Second Age. So I started off the video, of course, by saying Minas Tirith is a fortress, it is not a city. It has been jury-rigged to be a city by the time of the War of the Ring, but its primary focus is a military bastion, and the Citadel reflects that. So my understanding of the construction of the Citadel is that the final path up to the 7th level carves through the Great Rock Sail, as we've been calling it, or I've been calling it. So it carves through the Great Rock Sail, and as you then ascend up to the highest gate, the defenders can throw things down on you. So you walk through a sort of cleft in the rock face, which also is near the top of the rock face, so people can stand on top of the rock and fire down on you as you're climbing the road. Once you get through the gate, you then are met with the walls of the Citadel itself, so it's like an encased courtyard of death, if you will. And it's just an absolutely perfect kill zone, the Citadel itself. It would be able to be held very, very easily, with the only problem being having enough food supplies. Because, of course, getting out of the Citadel is tricky, but not impossible. Not impossible. But you have to, as I say, the enemy passes under the battlements of the Citadel just to get up to the 7th level proper. But the Citadel itself was chiefly a large great hall for meetings and things like that for the king, and of course it's where the throne is. It is a very long, thin space, and it's carved entirely out of stone. There is no wood or tapestries or the things like that in sight in the Citadel itself. Alcoves line the walls as you pass towards the throne at the end. There is a window in each alcove, and of course in front of these windows there are statues of great kings of Gondor. They're gazing down on any visitor who dares to visit the steward or the king of Gondor. The throne is at the end of the hall, and it's built on a large sort of dais with steps going up to it. They are of marble, and I believe the throne itself is also of marble. And then behind it is a large... I think it's carved into the rock itself. Is a large depiction of the White Tree of Gondor right behind the throne. The throne, of course, is for the king, but the steward must have somewhere to sit, and at the base of the steps of the dais that lead up to the king's throne is a smaller black throne where the steward sits. So, as it's depicted in the movie, actually, is quite representative of what it actually looks like, or what we're told it looks like. So quite on the money relatively there. And it's a smaller, as I say, little black chair for the steward. The courtyard of the citadel then leads off from this main hall. It's accessed through the citadel itself. So, of course, you don't come to the courtyard first. You come to that after you've already killed the defenders. And in here, there is famously is a great fountain and, of course, the White Tree of Gondor itself. Long dead by the time of the War of the Ring, but it is still guarded even at that time. And the guards of the fountain, the courtyard, and the doors of the citadel seem to be known collectively as the guards of the citadel before the court of the fountain. And they are marked out from their fellow guardians and guards and soldiers because they have mithril helmets, so the helmets shine in a way that the helmets of the other soldiers don't. They also, of course, have feathers of seabirds. So, the depiction of the guards in the fountain and the courtyard in the film is very alike to what they're described as. But these guards are distinctly remote from the other guards of the citadel, because Beregond says we speak to Beregond a lot in the book, and he wears far simpler attire and is simply a man of the third company of the Citadel Guard. So the guards of the Citadel before the Court of the Fountain, who in almost all Lord of the Rings media tend to be called Fountain Guard, they do seem to be a distinct battalion or regiment or something along those lines within the Citadel Guard being the sort of military body. So I do think there are two clear roles, and of course being a fountain guard, as we shall call them, is the most ceremonious position, but being just a general member of the Citadel Guard is still held in very high honour. So the Citadel Guard seem to be the sort of SAS to the standard army, if you will. They are an elite and honoured regiment that stands separate to the general soldiery of the military wing of Gondor. And we know this as well because, of course, the Fountain Guard, as we call them, they have the livery of Elendil, and they are the only ones permitted to wear this. So all of the other soldiers, and indeed the lesser Citadel Guard, Beregond being one, they just have simple attire with a white tree on their tabards, on their clothing. But the livery of the Fountain Guard is the full symbol of Elendil, which you may well also have seen. It's a more stylized depiction of the white tree with the 7 stars above it and then a crown above that. And that is Elendil's livery, and they wear that, but no one else can. Rising from the base of the courtyard is also, of course, the famed White Tower of Ecthelion. Now, this was built in the year 1900 of the Third Age, so about 1,200 years before the War of the Ring, the White Tower was actually constructed. But it only again came to be known the White Tower of Ecthelion because Boromir and Faramir's grandfather, Ecthelion II, who we've already mentioned, who built the Ramas Ekor, he repaired the White Tower. So it was in disrepair as well, and he repaired it, and it thereafter took his name. So Boromir, for example, mentions, have you ever seen the White Tower of Ecthelion? Certainly in the film, and in the books it's also mentioned. And they use the name Ecthelion, but it would have only been using that name for the past sort of 100 years or so, which I think is quite interesting. The Palantir, of course, is still housed there, because famously Denethor uses it and falls into madness at the whisperings of Sauron and all that he is shown through it. But it is known as the White Tower of Ecthelion. And it rises 300 feet itself into the air, which takes the height of Minas Tirith from the gate right to the tippity top of the Tower of Ecthelion, standing at 1,000 feet. Which sounds like an awful lot, but when you then think that the Eiffel Tower in Paris is 1,063 feet tall, you get a sort of understanding that Minas Tirith, whilst large and very impressive, is not absolutely enormous, and it probably is more akin to something along the lines of Mont Saint-Michel in France, or St. Michael's Mount. Is it called St. Michael's Mount? I'm sure it is. So it's not an absolutely enormous fortress. It is big, but it is not huge. And I think the film gives it a representation that perhaps it's absolutely ginormous, when in truth it's not that large. But anyway, so it's 1,000 feet from the top to the bottom, and 300 of those feet are just the White Tower of Ecthelion. Almost half of the city proper is again repeated in the tower. So I think that's quite interesting. Interestingly as well, a tower in the citadel rings a bell upon the hour of each day. So the city lives and breathes by the ringing of bells from the citadel, the heart of the city itself. And all of the guards of the citadel, be they fountain guard or standard citadel guard, they are all housed on the 7th level. As of course are the steward, the king, and any guests of importance. For lesser guests and just general visitors, the city still has working inns and lodging houses going about, and so people can live in amongst the city proper. It is mentioned by Beregond. Our final point of this video is that there are ways out of Minas Tirith from the top levels. So if the lower levels fell, the survivors could flee into Mount Mindalluin or onto Mount Mindalluin and then beyond to the White Mountains. And they could escape into Gondor. So it's not like the Hornburg where the only escape is through a cave, or Orthanc, for example, where there is no escape. There is a way out of Minas Tirith, but it's never mentioned, of course, in the film, and it need not be, because they win the Battle of the Pellinore Fields and the Siege of Minas Tirith, or the Siege of Gondor as it's known, but there are ways out. So that wraps up our video of Minas Tirith. I've gathered together as much information as I can. There is an awful lot of discussion I did see around the actual height of Minas Tirith, with various successive books and publications by non-Tolkien authorities suggesting that actually the city is much, much larger. But from what I can gather, 1,000 feet is said to be Tolkien's recommendation or understanding of the height of the city. And anything other than that is someone else's view of the height. But it's for each one of us to read up about if you're particularly interested in Minas Tirith. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview and a little bit more information about what Minas Tirith was actually like. Rather than just this great beacon of hope, I suppose is a good word, but it's certainly very interesting, I think. But for now, that is going to conclude this episode. So I do hope you've enjoyed listening along, and I do hope you are enjoying the lore videos in general. I'm going to revert the thumbnails back to being of what the actual topic is, rather than generic numbered thumbnails, because I think it took a little bit of the character away. So I shall return those. But other than that, that's concluding it. So until we speak again, dear friends, Navar Naden Perimad Melunin.